Assalamu alaikum, my dear students. So today in this video we are going to talk about oxytocin, the role of oxytocin in our body. But before we really discuss about the role of oxytocin in our body, let us see where from this oxytocin is produced and released in our body. So we have already discussed about the we have already discussed about the pituitary gland, the anatomy and the functions of pituitary gland. If you have not watched that video yet, please go and watch that first. Fine. So here is the hypothalamus. I hope you remember this. And we already know that this hypothalamus contains various nuclei, and one of the nucleus is the paraventricular nucleus. Paraventricular nucleus. Fine. And below the hypothalamus we have the pituitary gland. Here is the anterior pituitary gland and here is the posterior pituitary gland. And posterior pituitary gland is involved in the secretion or release of two hormones, and one hormone we have already discussed about is antidiuretic hormone, and the second hormone is what we are going to discuss today, that is oxytocin. So paraventricular nucleus is actually involved in the production of this oxytocin, and then this oxytocin is sent down through the axon and is stored here is in the form of vesicles in the axon terminal. And when a particular stimulus stimulates the paraventricular nucleus, then this paraventricular nucleus sends the action potentials down the axon, and then this oxytocin is released out from the posterior pituitary. Now we'll see what is the role of oxytocin in our body. The first role of oxytocin in our body is actually in the females, and that role we are going to talk about is on this organ right here, right? This is uterus, and uterus, I hope you know the basic anatomy of the uterus. It has the fundus, it has the body, it has the cervix, right? And then when we talk about the walls of the uterus, there are three layers in the walls of the uterus actually. The innermost is the endometrium. Here is endometrium. Okay, and then the middle layer is called as the myometrium. And myometrium is the thickest among all the three layers, and the outer layer is called as the perimetrium. And this oxytocin has its role actually on the myometrium of the uterus. Okay, and this oxytocin plays its role during the birthing process. Okay, suppose we we have the fetus here in the uterus, and that fetus is now ready to get delivered out, and then this fetus actually it stretches, it puts some stretch on the walls of the uterus. Okay, and because of that stretch, there are some stretch receptors which are activated in the walls of the uterus. And those stretch receptors gets activated, and those stretch receptors take this information to the paraventricular nucleus of the hypothalamus. Okay, and once these stretch receptors, they take this information to paraventricular nucleus gets activated, it generates the action potentials, and those action potentials are sent down the axon to the axon terminal, and then there is the release of oxytocin. Okay, and now this oxytocin comes and acts on the myometrium of the uterus. Okay, and it acts on these smooth muscle cells actually. Okay, now let us see how this oxytocin is actually playing its role in these smooth muscles of uterus. So here I have drawn one smooth muscle here. Okay, and this smooth muscle has a receptor, and that receptor is specially for this oxytocin. Okay, now this oxytocin comes and binds on the receptor of this smooth muscle cell of the uterus. Fine. Once this oxytocin, it binds on this receptor, it activates one protein inside, and that protein is called as GQ protein. So here is one protein that is called as GQ protein. That GQ protein is activated, and it is activated once this oxytocin binds on this oxytocin receptor of the smooth muscle cell. And once this GQ protein is activated, it activates one enzyme and that enzyme is called as phospholipase C. Phospholipase C. Okay, and then this phospholipase C, it activates one lipid that is called as PIP2. Okay, PIP2 stands for phosphatidyl inositol biphosphate. Okay, phosphatidyl inositol biphosphate. And once this phospholipase C, it acts on phosphatidyl inositol biphosphate, and it is converted into two things. One is called as diacylglycerol, and then the second is called as IP3. And IP3 stands for inositol triphosphate. Fine. And once these two things are produced from PIP2, now these two things has different roles inside the cell. Now IP3 acts on the sarcoplasmic reticulum of the cell. Sarcoplasmic reticulum, which has different roles inside the cell, and this sarcoplasmic reticulum has got one important role, that is the storage of calcium inside the cell. Fine. And this IP3 goes and acts on the sarcoplasmic reticulum and leads to release of calcium from sarcoplasmic reticulum into the intracellular fluid, or in the inside of the cell. Fine, or into the cytosol. And what this diacylglycerol is doing, it is activating protein kinase C. This diacylglycerol is activating protein kinase C, and this protein kinase C, it goes and phosphorylates different channels. Okay, and those channels are specially the channels for the calcium transport. Okay, and once this protein kinase C, it phosphorylates this calcium channel, the calcium starts rushing into the cell from extracellular fluid. Okay, now one more time, this oxytocin comes and binds on this receptor, and this once it binds on with this receptor, there is the activation of GQ protein. Then GQ protein acts on phospholipase C, or it activates phospholipase C. Then phospholipase C converts PIP2 into diacylglycerol and inositol triphosphate. Inositol triphosphate goes and acts on the sarcoplasmic reticulum, and sarcoplasmic reticulum is the storage site of storage of calcium, and then this calcium is released out of the sarcoplasmic reticulum. Then this diacylglycerol, it activates protein kinase C, and protein kinase C phosphorylates calcium channels, and those calcium channels are activated, and calcium starts coming from outside the cell into the cell. Fine. And then the overall result in this cell of the oxytocin is increasing the calcium level in the intracellular fluid. Okay, and then when we are increasing the calcium in the cytosol, what we are actually increasing, that is the contractility of the cell. because calcium is very important for the contraction of the cell, and we are increasing the calcium level inside the cell, and ultimately we are increasing the contractility of the cell. And on all these cells this oxytocin is acting, and all these cells are contracting, then that helps in the expulsion of fetus from the birth canal. Okay, then the oxytocin has its role on some other organs also. Okay, and one of the important organ it has its role on is mammary gland. Mammary gland, that is during lactation. Okay, suppose here is the mammary gland. And here is the nipple. And on this mammary gland, this oxytocin is acting, and there should be some stimulus for that. Just like we have the baby putting some stretch on the walls of the uterus, that is the stimulus, and those stretch receptors were activated. Now, in this case, the receptor is baby suckling. And because of that baby suckling, there are some special touch receptors, and those touch receptors are activated, and those touch receptors take this information to paraventricular nucleus of the hypothalamus. Okay, and once this paraventricular nucleus is stimulated, again it will send the action potentials down, and it will lead to release of oxytocin. And now what with this oxytocin will do, this oxytocin will come and act on the mammary gland, and it will act on the spatial cells inside, and those spatial cells are called as myoepithelial cells. Okay, and when these myoepithelial cells are targeted by oxytocin, oxytocin comes and acts on these myoepithelial cells, and these myoepithelial cells, in maybe the oxytocin is playing the same role. It is increasing the intracellular calcium, and it is increasing the contractility. Okay, and these myoepithelial cells contract, and the milk which is already being produced inside by with the help of prolactin, okay, the milk is already being produced inside. Now these myoepithelial cells contract, and they help in the ejection of milk. Okay, and they help in a process. Actually, that process is called as milk let down process or reflex. Milk let down reflex. One more time, oxytocin comes and acts on the myoepithelial cells which are there in the mammary gland, and those myoepithelial cells इनमें जो है intracellular calcium is increased, and intracellular calcium is increased, then there is the contraction of these myoepithelial cells, and that contraction helps in the ejection of milk, so that that baby is drinking that milk. Fine. Now that process is called as milk let down reflex. Then this oxytocin also has the role in the feelings like love and compassion. This oxytocin is actually called as love hormone or cuddling hormone. Then this oxytocin also has the role on the male reproductive system. And in the male reproductive system, it again leads to contractions, and those contractions जो है, they help in the ejaculation process. Okay, and that ejaculation is done by the contractions in the male reproductive system, and those contractions are also triggered by this oxytocin. Fine. So that is all about the actions of oxytocin in our body. I hope it was clear. Thank you. See you next time.